Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Barger. I teach FABS 400, the career development class. So thank you for joining my class today. We've opened it up to the rest of the film school. So thank you so much for signing on. With us today, we have Director of Photography, commonly known as a DP, which is Dennis Boni. He's based out of Baltimore, I believe, right, Dennis?
Just Bethesda, right here near the.
Okay, I knew you were Maryland. Okay, so the DC area. He's been a cameraman, DP in the area for 36 years now, I think. And he's worked with everything from film to pretty much any camera you could possibly ever want to work with. So we are going to start by just having a very casual Q&A with Dennis. If anyone has a question, if you can see the participants list and see your name to the right of that, if you hover over, there's like the mute button, the camera button, and then there's a raise hand option. If you click on that, Andrew, who's the host, can see that your hand is raised, and he'll have to call on you since I don't think I can see that. So I'll start off with a couple of questions with Dennis. If you have any questions, I'm going to open it up to the whole class after we get started. So Dennis, the first thing, you told me a really fascinating story when we first met about how you got started in the industry. So you've been working in DC for a very long time. And all the students here are going to be hopefully working in the industry in DC starting very soon. So why don't you just start a little bit about how you got into the industry and how you got your start?
Sure. While I was an undergrad, it didn't occur to me that you could make a living doing film and video production, even though I had already been bitten by the bug with regard to photography. As a probably 15, 16-year-old man, a friend's father who had a beautiful, well-made German Leica camera let me borrow it, take it out and shoot a few rolls of film. And that was the start of my love of composing images and the whole photochemical process. Watching the image show up in the chemistry in a dark room mystified me, and I found it to be a really organic, almost spiritual experience. Being pragmatic, I had a double major in biology and psychology, thinking I'd do something on a more traditional path, but I was really always obsessed with my love of photography. After graduating college, I traveled and ultimately got a job as a scuba diving instructor in Sharm el-Sheikh, the southernmost part of the Sinai Desert, where I combined my love for biology and the ocean and scuba diving with photography by doing some underwater work. I bought a camera from a traveling diver, and I started shooting underwater, which really was amazing and lots of fun. And when I got back, the young network CNN was trying to fill a 24-hour news cycle for the first time. Up until then, we had pretty much an hour and a half of news each day. And the country was tuned to one of three stations, pretty much the primary networks. And starting from that time in the early 80s when CNN kind of revolutionized the news industry, going to a 24-hour cycle, there was a new demand for media professionals all in all the job classifications. So I was a stringer hired to shoot some stories for them, and I began doing video work professionally. But I quickly chose to migrate towards a higher end of production being done on film when we didn't have the mandate of having our images show up that evening after already being edited and tracked and put into a package. It allowed for a much greater production values, and every part of the process is different when it's not necessarily for immediate consumption. You can take your time planning all aspects of the production, putting your heart and soul into the composition, the lighting, every aspect that you guys know all about being in this tract. So I migrated towards shooting film, which is also a really important little sidebar, both in terms of my career and professional development, but also it goes to discipline. And when you're shooting film, which these days is still happening quite a bit, but it's more niche, obviously. The world has gone digital. Um, Given the fact that the film is so expensive, you really, really have to think about it first. You don't pull the trigger on the camera until you're really sure your exposure is spot on. Your lens is clean, the rear element, the front element, you're avoiding flare unless you deliberately want it. You've composed the best possible image. Everything is right before you actually pull that trigger. In a digital domain, there isn't the relationship of cost to that decision to actually roll. And there are ramifications all the way down the line. Yes, you don't have to worry about the expense, but you're not putting as much forethought into the process. So I feel very blessed that I came up when I did while the technology was towards the end of the film era. Film was how we documented life and created narrative films and documentaries for over a century. And now we're in a new era where it's all digital, or the vast majority is digital. But I'm very grateful that I got to shoot film, both 35 millimeter for high-end feature films and a lot of Super 16. I owned a few different Super 16 cameras. For the technical folks, the gearheads, I started with a French-made Aeroflex SR. It's a German camera, but early on they had a French-made motor. I then moved to the Aton, which is a beautiful French-made camera that came out of Grenoble, France, and was the main competitor to the Aeroflex. And then I upgraded to the newer version of that called the XTR Prod, which had time code and magnetic drive. And anyway, I put more than 1,000,000 feet of film through that camera and shot in about 58 different countries worldwide and had just a lot of extraordinary experiences. Sarah was alluding to a transformative experience early in my career where I was in the right place at the right time. Here in Washington, D.C., Ronald Reagan was then president, and there was a microphone, a lapel mic on him, and the video crew in the room assumed that that mic was not open, so nobody could hear the president's remarks until everybody was good and ready for that. However, the mic was in fact open. Uh, the president made a joke about beginning to bomb Russia in the next 5 minutes, and the Russians actually got to hear that comment. And they didn't know that it was just a joke, and it actually became an international, um, a very big international moment where they actually thought, do we need to start getting our hand on the button? And it could have been really dramatic. Anyway, cooler heads prevailed. We let the Russians know it was just a joke and not to get their knickers in a twist. But one of the things that occurred as a result of that mistake was that the video crew was all fired. They were all of a sudden persona non grata. And the director of photography, who had been going to the White House once a month to film these sit downs with the president, recommended me to go in his stead, as he was no longer able to go in and do that. So as an early in my career kid in my 20s, shooting for CNN and other folks and beginning my career as a documentarian, I got to go in and film the most powerful person in the world. And we would shoot him on a variety of formats depending on who was asking for the footage. We typically do 5 to 7 30-second to 2-minute reads. And as talent goes, just using the term talent, even though he was in fact the leader of the free world, Reagan was brilliant as an actor. He came from that heritage. And so he was a great communicator, and it actually changed the nature of presidents ever since, because communications are so important. He would read 5 to 7 reads. He would maybe need 10 takes total to get through all 7 reads, meaning 4 or 5 of them wouldn't even need a single retake. 1 or 2 every once in a while he would do a safety because of a tiny flub. So it was an interesting moment for me, and it helped propel my career.
So did you just buy a camera and say, hey, I'm a cameraman, and start getting hired as a cameraman?
Well, back in those days, everything was being captured on video for news, and video wasn't anywhere near the quality we're used to today. A typical iPhone or Android phone has a camera that is just 1,000 times better than the highest end broadcast camera of the day. They were very expensive. My first broadcast camera, I remember well, set me back about $37,000 back in the 80s. And when I borrowed a couple $1,000 from my dad, who's a salt of the earth school teacher, he thought the $5,000 he was fronting me was covering the whole camera, which already blew his mind. And when I explained that that was a tiny fraction of the total cost, there was a stunned silence, after which he said, "That's more than I spent on my house, son."
More than he was making in a year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. But I paid him back ahead of schedule, and have amortized every camera since. And if people want to go towards the technical, I'm happy to go there. So I'd like the students to kind of direct the flow of this session. I'm thrilled to be here and share my life and experience. But I want to make sure that I am attending to the appropriate subject that you guys are really interested in. You know, I could talk about cameras all day long. I've used every iteration right up to today's most recent Era Flex masterpiece.
I know a lot of my students want to be DPs or directors, and a lot of them have asked, should they invest in a camera first? Should they? I was recommending rent a couple cameras, start looking at job postings and see if people are looking for specific cameras, and start doing your due diligence. Then rent some cameras and start working with them and seeing which camera you end up using more and which one you like. But can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. The technology with regard to cameras changes every X number of months. It used to be years, and now it's measured in months, and the cameras are expensive. And if you're not careful, you'll end up having trouble amortizing that investment. There are so many out there that I think it's a lot wiser to cut your teeth using other people's equipment. You can work all kinds of crazy deals. If you need it for a longer time for a more elaborate project, be it a documentary, a narrative, or a feature, the more days you need it, the less days you pay for. I was shocked the first time I went to rent a Panavision camera, the world's fanciest 35 millimeter camera, that it came at a 10-day month. And if you beat up the Panavision rental house that you were getting it from, you could get a 1.5 day week, meaning you could literally pay for 5, 6 days and keep the camera for a month. These sort of deals are out there, and the cameras are the hardest things to amortize because it's a fickle market and the technology keeps changing. That said, the fundamentals of photography can be, you can hone your craft with a camera that isn't necessarily best in breed. Composing an image is composing an image. Telling a good story is telling a good story. Picking compelling subject matter and writing a good script and directing your talent well. These are all the fundamentals that are agnostic with regard to whatever format you're using. So worry less about having the best in breed camera. I invested about $90,000 in the first Arri Alexa camera I bought back in 2011. That camera's now on eBay for about $4 grand. So you can, you know, if you're okay shooting HD, which is already now considered antiquated, now that we're already migrating to a 4K and above world with regard to resolution, literally a $90,000 Arri Alexa can be had for $4,000 or $5,000. So it shows you how quickly the technology changes. If you want to think about making some money and having access to some toys, I've learned that the equipment that can work with any camera platform tends to be a better investment. You get a small jib, you get a slider. You can put any camera on a slider. It frees the camera up to give you a little bit of lateral movement. You could either truck with it or you could dolly with it, and you can achieve a little bit of production values, which you can add to whatever you're doing. And as new cameras come out, you just put a new camera on it. So invest in a good fluid head, invest in some lighting, invest in some production toys that are agnostic with regard to cameras, because the cameras are going to keep changing.
We have a question from Chris.
Hello, Dennis.
Chris?
One question that I have for you is, what are some of your favorite techniques that you like to use to get shots in tight corners or other small spaces?
Well, that's a great question. You are more limited in your choice of focal lengths when you're in a smaller space, obviously. But when you get too wide, I think the viewer starts being distracted potentially from that choice of lens, because the wider you get, oftentimes you get a little more distortion. So I think one of the things that I think is a really great tool is that there are a lot of wonderful new apps that are available that can let you preview what the angle of view would be should you select a particular lens. So back in the day, we used to use a director's finder. They were very expensive because they were optical, and we would put whatever 35 millimeter prime on it in order to view our scene through that lens to see exactly what our parameters would be of our frame. Now you can do that with your iPhone. So you pick the format that you're shooting, so it knows what aspect ratio and what size sensor you're using. And then you pick whatever lens, and you can literally get in your little dorm room, if that's where you are shooting, let's say, and you could look at the two people on the bed that you want to frame up and click a little button, and your phone's camera will show you what it would look like if you had a 35 millimeter lens versus a 25 versus a 50. And it's a really valuable tool to help you as an aspiring director of photography be able to preview exactly what the parameters of your frame would be without even needing the camera there, just to start learning how to frame and anticipate the right lens choice.
Do you know the name of that app by any chance?
I use one called Cadrage, Cadrage, but I don't know that it's necessarily the best. It's just one real simple one. I can show you quickly. I don't know if it's going to translate, but so this is down in the lower right, I believe you can see the lens choice.
You can move it over a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
And then, so that's showing you 50, and now I'll go to 25, and now you can see it's a wider frame. It's seeing part of me, and as you change it, now we're all the way, you know, it can't even get that wide. Hold on. This one's not even getting wider than 25, but anyway, it's a good way of previewing what you're going to shoot.
So we have a question from Connor. He wanted to know what your thoughts are on working as a freelancer versus working under a company when you're first starting off in the industry.
Another great question. it's hard to make that call because there is economic reality and you have to make sure you can pay your bills. It, for me, and I think many freelancers in this industry, it requires a real leap of faith. Um, you're kind of out there without a net when you're freelance. And it's a total feast or famine type of world. When you're lucky enough, if you are, to get hooked into a big ongoing project, all of a sudden it feels more secure. You can count on a certain amount of work coming up. You have a way to anticipate covering your rent and your bills, and suddenly the pressure is off. When that project wraps and you're waiting for the phone to ring and the days are infrequent, all of a sudden life gets more precarious. So it's a real balancing act, and it's a very personal decision, I think, you guys will have to make moving forward. There are some wonderful staff jobs where, with the benefit of that biweekly check, you can be learning quite a bit and doing good work. So there's certainly advantages and disadvantages to both. I've been lucky enough that even early on when things were slow and I was starting to think about throwing in the towel, not sure that it would be viable in the long run, I was blessed enough that those bigger projects came through. I was lucky enough to get hired by a husband and wife production team here in Washington, company called Screenscope, that were doing really nice documentaries for PBS. And they had a series called Journey to Planet Earth, which I went on to shoot in maybe 28 different countries, telling all sorts of interesting stories. So to give you just a little bit of background on that one, the pilot it all dealt with environmental themes. And the pilot was called Rivers of Destiny. And we shot all up and down the Mississippi. And then we went to film in Israel and Jordan along the Jordan River. And then we went to Vietnam to film along the Mekong. And then we went to the Amazon in Brazil and filmed along the Amazon. And so each episode, it was in a day when they had much bigger budgets for what they called blue chip documentaries. And there were a lot more eyes tuned in to fewer programs. So they had bigger budgets. But you know, that we did one that I just thought of today, given the pandemic we're all living through. We did one called Hot Zones, and we explored infectious disease. It was a terrifying assignment for a young photographer with two small kids at home and a wife. And we basically went where the disease vector that we were looking at was greatest. So we did malaria stories in a part of sub-Saharan Africa where more people die from malaria than anywhere else on the planet. We went to remote parts of Peru to film stories about yellow fever. We went to a remote part of Central Asia in Uzbekistan where people were suffering from a drug-resistant form of tuberculosis, etc. So that was a scary assignment, but it was very eye-opening to get to film all over the world. Matt Damon was the narrator on the series. We shot for almost 2 decades and told a lot of great stories.
We had another question from Michael asking if that 90K that you spent on your camera, I'm assuming you recouped it, and do you know how quickly?
You know, I wish I did better at counting. It does have a happy ending. I had that camera work quite a bit, and I've always been a stickler for quality. Of course, all the fundamentals matter, but I never wanted to handicap myself by using anything but the best possible technology. So back in the day, I'd always try to get my clients, when they could possibly afford it, to move up to shooting film as opposed to video, because that was significantly better aesthetically in my own judgment. And now that we're in a digital domain, Arri, I still believe makes the best possible camera, and I love shooting with it. But that said, it's still the fundamentals. You need a good story, you need good lighting, you need great interviews. You can't fall down on any part of the job. And that said, you could have the best camera in the world, and if you're not telling a compelling story, nobody's going to care. And if you have a compelling story and you're shooting it on an iPhone, people will be more interested.
Yep, exactly. And that kind of answers, I think, Michael's question of where was it? Does having a top tier camera help you win jobs?
Well, it actually does in some instances. We have subsequently upgraded from the Alexa, which is only a 2.8 native camera, to the Amira, which is a 4K camera. And I have clients, for instance, that Ellen DeGeneres' people in Hollywood send their crews wherever. They were coming to DC to film a really wonderful, uplifting event with the former First Lady, Michelle, who I miss desperately. And she was giving laptop computers and all kinds of wonderful gifts to help some youngsters in a underprivileged, underserved part of the district over in Anacostia. The gift of laptops and building a new basketball court. And anyway, it was a lovely event, but they're shooting with state-of-the-art equipment. They're coming out of Hollywood on a well-funded show, and they needed to pick up an additional cinematographer with matching technology. So they asked around, and there are only a handful of cinematographers in this market that have invested the $75,000 in that particular camera. So whereas there are plenty of talented cinematographers in the market, when that group called, they needed somebody that was A, in the union, B, well recommended, and C, owning the appropriate technology to match their equipment. So I had that trifecta, so that job came to me that wouldn't have come to somebody with a Red or a Canon or a Sony FS7.
Okay, we have a lot of good questions coming in. Thank you, students. I'm going to call on Simona next. She asks, what was the process behind getting on a project like Planet Earth, which I don't think it was Planet Earth, it was a different show, right? Planet Earth Hot Zones, right?
Yeah, the series was called Journey to Planet Earth, and I was lucky enough in that instance to be there from day one. So I shot the pilot that the filmmakers didn't even know if that was going to take and be as popular as it was. Lucky for them, and through a lot of dedicated hard work, the show got legs, did very well, and went on to, they were able to secure funding to do the next and the next episode and develop it into a whole series. And fortunate for me, I worked very hard and everything looked good, and they kept hiring me back. So that
first job though, the first show that you shot with them, do you remember?
Yeah, back in the day, you needed that reel, which is always really difficult because it's hard to even get the cut shows. Now it's easier because everybody's posting everything. Back then, you needed to go to the people for whom you shot and get a dub of the video on some hopefully broadcast quality, not too far down the line, because it would degrade the further you got from that master. And you'd have to always be cutting reels. Lucky for me at this point, it's mostly a word of mouth thing. I haven't upgraded my website in 30 years. So that's something I probably should do, but.
So your reel did help you get that job?
It did.
Okay, that's really good to know. Okay, we have so many good questions. So James asked, you've worked in a time with new technology emerging and learning to adapt. I read you were also picked to be trained with the Steadicam, and that you were a Steadicam operator for 20 years. Do you see any new emerging technology that cinematographers should research and learn now to get ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think that dovetails very nicely. It's a great question. And that dovetails really well into an earlier point that I made about the advantage of choosing when you're getting ready to begin your career in earnest and you're trying to figure out where best to invest your money. Steadicam is an example of another agnostic piece of equipment. If you learn to master a Steadicam, you can put any camera on it. You can put, so if some company like Red that created disruptive technology, it had always been dominated by either Arri or Panasonic or Sony. All of a sudden, a guy who makes sunglasses creates a camera that is now being used by many feature film directors. So you can always put a new camera on a Steadicam. I've actually been doing it for 30 years at this point, and I was very, very blessed because back in that day, you had to submit a reel to even get into the class to learn the skill of Steadicam. And because I'm particularly OCD, I didn't I wasn't willing to take a professional assignment with the Steadicam until I had practiced religiously for 5 years with it. I don't know if people pay those kind of dues, but I came up at a time when if you were trying to get into the film industry, you would be a loader and you'd load the magazines day in and day out on production and eventually get a break to become a second AC. And after doing that for a number of years, you move up to first. And finally, you'd get a crack at operating. You would never use the term director of photography short of 20 years in. And so that was kind of the world I came up in. And so when I learned Steadicam at the end of taking the class, I knew I didn't have the skill set that somebody who had been doing it on a professional level had. So I had one, I invested in it. I had it set up in my apartment and then in my first house. And I'd come home from work and I'd slap a camera on it and I'd walk around chasing the kids around the house till I had mastered the craft. And after about 5 years, I would tell clients that were trying to hire me with the Steadicam, yes, I know how to use this. I hope I'm up to speed and can do it at a quality level that will enhance your production. But how about I bring it out and we make sure that you're comfortable with my skill level. And they always were because I've always had more demanding, I've always been more critical of my work than the people for whom I work, being a perfectionist.
That's really important. So, okay, that kind of dovetails into a follow-up question that kind of got asked. So starting out as a DP, so would you then like bill your rates out lower than what maybe older Steadicam operators would have billed them their time out in order to kind of get those first jobs? Or how do you deal with, especially someone new in the market who's trying to build themselves out, like negotiating rates, and how do you get those first jobs?
Sure. I think early on, you can't let money get too in the way because it's really about experience, which is more valuable if you're doing good work and you're getting more proficient as a director of photography or Steadicam operator. Um, and I think it's really more critical that you work on honing your skill than making sure that you're getting the top dollar for it. I was so excited about taking on new assignments early in my career. I had some embarrassing situations where clients would talk to me about an upcoming project. I'd get so lost talking about it and coming up with visual creative ways of telling the story and all of that. And I'm so all in. And at some point they'd say, don't we need to talk about budget? And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess we do. But I'm like, whatever, that because that wasn't as important to me as gaining the experience.
So Josh has a question. So especially for students who aren't making that much money, do you have any suggestion on how to get enough funds to even create a basis for freelance work? Because taking out loans seems like it can be rocky territory, especially in today's economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the best ways in this industry is to offer your assistance on productions. Seek out good good folks who are doing high-end work. You can do so much research sitting in front of your computer. You can look at other people's work and learn from that. That's like doing homework. You can see what works for you and what resonates, and groups that are doing good production. See if you can go and offer your help to them. If you offer yourself even as a PA, don't let ego get in the way. Um, Go out, spend 10, 12 hours on set working hard for people, and let them know that you have a good work ethic and that you treat people with dignity and respect, and you behave in an ethical, honest, and appropriate manner, treating everybody around you with kindness and respect and dignity. You'll earn respect from your coworkers. And when they know that you check off all those boxes and you're a valuable asset to have on set, the next time they'll be willing to pay you for your time.
You touched on this a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of how you found your network and mentorships and how you became a better cinematographer?
Yeah, I think this again dovetails with an earlier remark about how many years I spent practicing Steadicam before actually getting paid for it. Um, when I would get an assignment early on in my career that I sensed maybe a little bit over my head, I was always so worried about not delivering as excellent a product as the client deserved, that rather than try to make as much money as I could by trying to assume more responsibility than I might be ready for, I would defer instead to hire people that I knew more than I did. So as an up and coming director of photography, I knew that there were people that understood lighting well more than I did when I was still green and learning the craft. So I would hire the best gaffers in the market. They were expensive. They would be earning more than I was because I'm an aspiring DP just trying to gain something for my reel. But then I got to watch people that had started in the industry before I did and worked with some A-list people. And so that's how I got mentored. And I really valued the experience of hiring people that I knew more than I did, so I could learn. And you got to really pay attention. You got to watch what they're doing. And
So Mohammed asks, and I've not heard this saying, but that some say having an artistic eye is a gift and can't be learned or taught. I've never heard that. I don't necessarily agree with that, but how do you feel about that statement?
um, I think it'd be presumptuous to act um, like I was born with any kind of a gift. I think for some people they certainly can be more visual and it can seem more instinctual. For me, it was never early on. I never took classes in photography, but just felt kind of an innate comfort in the way I framed the world. Subsequently, I did do a little more investigating and try to learn a little more of the nuances. And what you'll find is while there's some rules, there are a lot of really talented people that break those rules. And while there is a way to create a frame that has harmony, when you violate those rules, you create tension. And depending on what you're attempting to do, it's important to understand the difference between the two. So there's a traditional frame that feels harmonious and compositionally pure, and then you can kind of violate those rules, but it doesn't necessarily make one right or the other wrong. Fortunately for me, the way I would compose images that felt organic and natural to me seemed to resonate with my audience.
Okay, I want to talk about Charm City Rumpus a little bit. I think everyone should have watched that. Can you talk about, so that was written by someone else and you were just brought on as a DP for that, correct?
I directed that one.
You
And he
directed.
served as DP.
Can you talk a little bit about having two roles on set and the challenges of that?
Absolutely. And that's a really, really great question. Typically speaking, I tend to react less positively when people are trying to get into my freelancer loop and after their name they put director, producer, editor, VFX artist, whatever, and they list every job title in the industry. I really early on focused exclusively on being a cinematographer. I have subsequently added the mantle of director and been working towards directing in the past 5 years, but I don't edit. There are people that do that day in and day out and do it really well. And I don't do graphics. People do that day in and day out. So I think it's really good if you can to specialize. When you are doing an independent film, you don't have the luxury of being able to put the top caliber person in each job category. So invariably, you have to wear more than one hat. Charm City Rumpus, I'm proud of because while I was directing, which was a new role for me, and trying to get the best performance from my talent, I was really still making sure that the lighting was up to my very rigid standards and the set decoration and everything. So yes, we did wear more hats, but I think the product is still a good one.
Love that. I love that film. So I think you did a fantastic job with it. Okay, some more questions. Michael wants you to talk about the pre-production process a little bit.
Absolutely. Pre-production is crucial, guys. The more you anticipate, the better. One of the big revelations I had when I was hired for the first time to go to Hollywood and shoot something on a big soundstage with a big full crew, what I learned was an interesting revelation. Here in a smaller market where people wear more than one hat, where we don't get much feature work, where there aren't big ad agencies doing expensive commercials, or if they do, they typically bring crew from LA or New York. What I learned was overtime isn't taken for granted. Here, where you don't do a lot of pre-production, where you don't have all that planning and forethought, invariably clients will attempt to do more in a typical production day than they can. And it's more the rule rather than the exception that you cannot make the day, meaning you're trying to achieve more than you realistically can in the number of hours that you have to accomplish your task. So it's not at all infrequent that you run long. When the day goes long, you're paying people at a premium, at time and a half, when they're working at their least efficient because they're tired. That's when things get damaged. That's when people get hurt. That's when your production suffers. And when you go out to Hollywood and you work on the big stuff, what you realize is it all happens in the 10 hours you've allotted, because it's not a go without saying that you're going to go long. That's an indication that you did not do sufficient pre-production. And part of what you learn is that when you do meticulous pre-planning and you put the appropriate resources in the production, you can make the day. And it takes a good production manager or associate producer, he or she that has done this for years and has the experience to know how long it takes. And you look at a typical schedule, they'll invariably forget to put the time in that you're moving from one location to another. Or they'll forget to send somebody to bring the lunch to set, and you lose the time getting to the restaurant and ordering. And the more energy and effort you put into anticipating the appropriate time for everything, the more likely you are to make the day.
Yep, I agree. Whenever I was a PM, I always try to make sure we were on time, because it's not, it's a waste of money. Like you said, when you're paying people overtime to do work when they're tired. So we had a couple questions about the travel documentaries that you're shooting. So gear has changed a lot, and I know now it's a lot easier if you can throw like everything in a bag. Like I can throw things in my laptop and my camera and a small light kit in one bag and carry it around. Can you talk about the challenging environments you have when you're doing travel documentaries and how you deal with gear and weight limitations?
Sure. Well, I have gotten my kit down to 10 pieces. So I'm amazed that you can keep it in one. I don't know what I'm missing. I'm going to have a separate conversation with you after, Sarah. But I literally, I have a cart called a Cart Master. It can hold about 600 pounds. It's smaller than the bigger UPS carts, but not by much. And with the Steadicam, I can get it to 10 pieces. Without the Steadicam, I can get it to 8. Again, I'm using a camera that's heavy, so it demands a professional tripod that can handle the weight. I like to have a monitor for critical viewing and playback. So some people may consider that more of a client monitor. I use a 17-inch, so that takes up a case. Lighting wise, I can keep it to just a handful of units, but I'll usually pick some up in whatever market I go to, unless the documentary is almost exclusively exterior. One of the amazing advantages these days, guys, in the time that you're coming up, is how light sensitive the cameras have gotten. When I first got into the industry, the cameras, the typical film we used was an ASA 100 film stock. And to put that in perspective, a Sony FS7, which you guys all know about, has a default ASA of 2000. The Panasonic VariCams that we just used for an HBO special in the Howard Theater, they had an ASA you could bump to 4000. So each time you double the ASA, you need half the light. So we started with ASA 100. When they shot the feature films earlier in the last century, the ASA of the Technicolor film was 6. ASA 6. We now have cameras that shoot at 4000. So you don't need as many lights, and the image looks quite good in low light, which you guys can all take advantage of. But one of the other tricks you all should learn, and is to get, if you can get any kind of a press pass. So I have one from my days at Discovery, and you flash that to the person at United or the few airlines that still honor a media discount, and you'll pay $50 a bag for the extra bags, and they'll let you have weight up to 100 pounds. So that's a really important thing. And you can get a press pass from almost anybody, and they don't really scrutinize them. So,
I didn't know that piece of information.
yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think a couple people have asked, basically, do you recommend, I think you answer this, but especially when you're first starting out, should you try to do a bunch of different things, or should you pick one thing and just focus on
Well, it's a tough one because, again, it goes to what's going to be viable in terms of a livelihood. So I think it can't hurt to at least master certain skills enough that you can be able to work in different capacities on different projects early on so that it's more viable financially while you're working on your own specialty. I see a question from Michael about whether or not to shoot a clean exposure or worry more about the grading on the back end. So a quick answer there is I like to have the image be as good as possible so it requires the least amount of energy later to really dial it in. But that said, you have to learn when to pull the plug, and it'll be easier for somebody and less expensive for somebody to do that last 5 or 10% of refining the image so you can move on in the production process. So I would say, like, for instance, some people don't think you really need to worry about the white balance because you're going to do the color grading later. But anybody doing that color grading, the closer you are to begin with, the better they'll be able to dial it in later. So it really is time management. Get it as close as you can quickly. Learn about color temperature. Learn how to mix color temperature, and then don't keep obsessing for that last 5%.
As an editor, I would like to say, shoot it right in production, please. I do not, if you want it to look a certain way, especially if you're the director or the DP, shoot it a certain way. Do not rely on your editors to make it look the way that you want it to look. Because we're going to make it look how we want it to look. That's only if we have the time to do it.
Yeah.
I had a question. So next Wednesday, we have our union day. And so we have the Directors Guild coming in, IATSE, the Producers Guild, and someone from SAG-AFTRA. So in order to transition and kind of tease that a little bit, you're in the Directors Guild, correct?
I'm in IATSE 600.
Can you talk a little bit about why being a member of the union is valuable, and if you suggest that is something that students should look into?
Yeah, it's a tough call. I would say first get plenty of experience before thinking about joining the union. Once you are working enough as a professional and it seems viable to make a career at your chosen craft, then you can contemplate union membership. It's expensive. I think it was around $10,000 to join IA, and you need to show documentation of 100 professional jobs. It's a double-edged sword. There are some people that see that you're in the union and fear hiring you, thinking you're going to have some kind of a union mentality, which can have some negative connotations because some folks working on smaller independent projects tend to condescend a little bit because they've worked on bigger, more well-funded projects. I think that's just a bad idea and shouldn't be the case, but it is. So there's some people that actually don't want to hire you when they see that you're in the union. By the same token, the other half of that equation is that there are projects that you simply couldn't get on. This thing I just did for HBO, they're not going to hire you if you're not in the union. It's a union production. Ellen DeGeneres' show is not going to pick you up if you're not in the union. No feature film will let you, I just did the behind the scenes for a Showtime series that Ethan Hawke directed in and starred in. I couldn't be on that set not being in IA. So there are projects you can do that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And when it's a union production, you know it's going to be run more smoothly. You know people are going to be professional, and you know you're going to get paid, and you know that it's going to be a safe working environment. And the unions really looks out for its members. So
Great, thank you for talking about that a little bit. So it sounds like that's a little bit for more seasons once you've been in the industry for a while. And one last question: is that a Capital Camera T-shirt?
it is, yeah, but I'm not playing favorites. I love Erish as well, and DC Camera. And the funny thing is, when I went to put a T-shirt on today, I was going to grab the DC Camera, and I thought I shouldn't actually be plugging one or the other. It turns out Capital Camera is run by Kyle Palanch, and Kyle began his career as a intern for me.
Oh, and that's a great closing question. So I know my students are looking for internships. Can I send them in your direction?
Once this pandemic settles and we see where we are, I'm always happy to mentor and bring folks out.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis. Before we wrap, I do want to plug that tomorrow at 1:30, we're going to have another Visiting Filmmakers lecture series with director Jennifer, I don't want to butcher her last name, but I think it's Bikewald.
Bachel. Her name is Bachel.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia.
Okay.
And she is a documentary filmmaker who's been making docs for 25 years. So she'll be talking about her latest film, Anthropocene, The Human Epoch. Before we wrap it up, all of my students, please stay on this chat. Do not log out after this session is over, because we're gonna have class. Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing, Dennis?
No, it's been a joy to answer some of your questions, and I think there's some exciting things happening in the industry. I am thrilled that more women are working as cinematographers and directors, and it's time that Hollywood and the whole industry get rid of any kind of sexist ideas. There are just a lot of really hyper talented women in all of the crafts, and it's a joy to collaborate with them. And I wish you guys all the success in the world in your new careers.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis. And everyone, thank you for your excellent questions. And until next time.
Excellent. Take care, everybody.